In the clandestine surgical room, the millionaire strangles his pregnant wife, thinking he will erase his past forever. But her mother arrives too late to save her, and just early enough to save the baby. And this woman's vengeance transforms the monster into prey. If you enjoy stories like this, watch until the end, subscribe to this channel, and leave a comment telling us where you're listening from. The cold light of dawn began to filter through the heavy curtains of the master bedroom of the penthouse, one of the most coveted addresses on Park Avenue. Madison Foster awoke with a sharp pain in her lower abdomen, different from the contractions her doctor had said were normal in the 8th month of pregnancy. She automatically reached for the left side of the king-size bed, seeking the comforting warmth of her husband, but found only cold, perfectly stretched sheets. Richard hadn't slept at home again. It was the 3rd consecutive night. At 32, Madison had built a solid career as an architect before meeting Richard Blackwood, the entrepreneur who had transformed a small construction company, inherited from his father, into one of the largest real estate conglomerates in the Northeast. The wedding had been a fairy tale, live-streamed to 3,000 guests from a historic estate in the Hudson Valley. 2 years later, when she discovered she was pregnant, Madison believed she would finally have the complete family she had always dreamed of. But for the last 3 months, ever since her belly began to grow visibly, Richard had become an elegantly dressed stranger who moved through the house like a corporate phantom, always with his phone glued to his ear, always with urgent meetings that lasted until dawn. The pain returned, more intense this time. Madison got up with difficulty, leaning on the furniture until she reached the imported marble bathroom. That's when she noticed the light bleeding. Her heart raced. She reached for the phone on the nightstand, but before she could dial her obstetrician, a wave of dizziness sent her collapsing back onto the bed. With trembling fingers, she managed to send a message to Richard, to her mother, to anyone who could help. The immense apartment felt like a silent mausoleum at that moment. The last thing Madison saw before losing consciousness was the phone screen illuminating an automated reply from Richard, stating that he was in a strategic meeting and could not be disturbed. Across town, in a modest-looking private clinic in Soho, Richard adjusted the knot of his Italian tie in front of the bathroom mirror. Beside him, drying her blonde hair with a clinic towel, was Vivian Castell, the 38-year-old corporate lawyer who coordinated all of the company's mergers and acquisitions. The affair had begun 6 months earlier during a business trip to Miami and had intensified exactly when Madison announced her pregnancy. For Richard, impending fatherhood didn't represent joy, but rather a financial and emotional trap from which he desperately wanted to escape. Vivian proposed marriage for the 3rd time that morning, gesturing with a detailed report that showed how a strategic divorce could preserve the majority of Richard's assets, especially if he acted before the child's birth. She had meticulously researched legal loopholes, consulted family law experts, and designed a plan that would turn Madison into a wealthy but insignificant footnote in Richard's official biography. All he had to do was sign the documents she had prepared and let the lawyers handle the unpleasant details. Richard glanced at his phone and saw Madison's desperate messages piling up on the screen. He felt a momentary pang of something that might have been remorse, but Vivian placed a hand on his shoulder and whispered promises of freedom, of responsibility-free travel, of an unencumbered corporate life where an heir wouldn't complicate international mergers or demand emotional attention. Richard took a deep breath and silenced the notifications. He had already made his decision. Madison would discover in the worst way possible that the fairy tale had a bitter end. Meanwhile, at the Park Avenue apartment, it was the housekeeper who found Madison unconscious 2 hours later. Desperate, the employee couldn't reach Richard and called the only other emergency number. She knew. Mrs. Helen Foster, Madison's mother, a 60-year-old retired cardiovascular surgeon who lived in a discreet apartment on the Upper East Side. Helen arrived in 20 minutes, accompanied by her private driver, and upon assessing her daughter's condition, wasted no time with additional phone calls. She carried Madison to the car herself, instructing the driver to take them directly to Mount Sinai Hospital, where she still held medical privileges even after retirement. During the tense drive through the morning traffic of New York City, Helen held her daughter's unconscious hand and allowed herself to feel the cold fury she normally reserved for emergency surgery. She had never fully trusted Richard. His performative charm, the calculated way he had won over Madison, the grandiose promises that seemed scripted by image consultants. Helen knew men like him from the hospital environment, tycoons who treated wives like interchangeable trophies and children like items on a balance sheet. But Madison had been in love, and Helen had learned decades ago that maternal warnings rarely competed with hormones and promises of eternal happiness. In the hospital's emergency room, a team was already on standby thanks to the contacts Helen had activated on the way. Madison was immediately taken to an observation room, while doctors ran tests. The diagnosis came 20 minutes later: placental abruption, a potentially serious condition that required intensive monitoring and a possible early delivery. The baby was in distress, but stable. Madison would need to be admitted, likely until the birth. Helen signed all the forms, authorized all the procedures, and it was only when she sat down in the impeccably clean waiting room that she realized she was holding Madison's phone, which the driver had grabbed from the apartment. The screen still showed the unread messages sent to Richard. Helen typed in the password she'd known since gifting her daughter the device and began to explore. What she discovered over the next few hours, while Madison slept under light sedation in a private room, destroyed any remaining illusion about her son-in-law. Deleted messages recovered from the cloud revealed months of meticulously hidden betrayal. But it was when she found a PDF document attached to an email that Helen felt the blood run cold in her veins. It was a preliminary divorce plan drafted by Vivian Castell, detailing strategies to minimize child support, question paternity through strategically requested genetic tests, and even suggestions on how to contest Madison's mental capacity to care for the child if she resisted the proposed terms. Helen photographed every page, every message, every piece of evidence. She was not just a mother protecting her daughter, she was a born strategist, trained by decades of surgical decisions where hesitation meant irreversible consequences. Richard Blackwood believed he was playing a game whose rules he controlled. He had no idea he had just awakened an infinitely more dangerous adversary, one who operated not out of greed or ambition, but out of the fierce, calculating love of an American matriarch, whose sole purpose now was to protect her lineage and ensure that no man, no matter how powerful, could abandon his family with impunity. When Madison woke up in the late afternoon, confused and fragile, she found her mother by her bedside. Helen held her hand and said with a practiced calm that everything would be all right, that the baby was safe, that she just needed to rest. Madison asked about Richard, and Helen replied that he had been informed but was handling urgent company matters. It was a lie. Helen had not called her son-in-law. She wanted him to continue believing he was in control, that his betrayals remained secret, that his plan of abandonment would be executed without resistance. Arrogant men made more mistakes when they felt invincible. In the following days, while Madison remained hospitalized under observation, Helen mobilized resources she had accumulated over a 40-year successful medical career. She discreetly hired a team of family law attorneys, not the pompous Wall Street firms Richard would know, but competent and discreet professionals who operated on the fringes of New York's power structure. She hired private investigators to map every move of Richard and Vivian, and, most importantly, she began making calls to colleagues in the corporate world, people who owed her favors from the days she saved the lives of CEOs and their families in middle-of-the-night emergency surgeries. Richard finally appeared at the hospital on the third night, bearing expensive flowers and elaborate excuses about international mergers and video conferences with Chinese investors. He sat beside Madison's bed, held her hand with the rehearsed performance of a devoted husband, and promised he would be more present from then on. Madison, still fragile and sedated, believed every word. But Helen, watching from a chair in the corner of the room, saw through the facade. She noticed the exact moment Richard discreetly checked his watch, calculating how long he needed to stay to keep up appearances. She noticed how his eyes never truly focused on Madison, but rather on some abstract point above her head, as if he were memorizing lines from a script. When Richard finally left, claiming an early morning meeting he couldn't postpone, Helen followed him with her eyes until he disappeared down the brightly lit hospital corridor. It was then that she made a decision that would change the course of everything. Richard would not abandon Madison through legal documents and humiliating financial settlements. That would allow him to keep his reputation, his public image as a successful businessman, his position at the top of New York's social pyramid. No. If he wanted to get rid of his family, Helen would ensure that the process destroyed everything he truly valued: his business credibility, his network of contacts, his sense of absolute control over his own destiny. Helen picked up her phone and began making the calls that would trigger the first phase of her plan. She wasn't seeking revenge in the melodramatic sense of the word. She sought something more precise, more surgical: justice through the systematic destruction of the illusion of impunity that men like Richard wore as armor. And unlike her son-in-law, who operated on impulsive selfishness, Helen had the patience of someone who had spent years mastering cardiovascular procedures that tolerated neither haste nor uncontrolled emotion. Richard Blackwood's heart was still beating strong in his chest, but his empire was about to go into fatal fibrillation, and he didn't even feel the first signs of the impending collapse. 2 weeks later, under the grey sky of an October afternoon, Madison and Richard's son came into the world via an emergency C-section. Gabriel was born weighing 7 pounds, crying forcefully, his lungs proving his vitality to a surgical suite full of competent professionals Helen had personally selected. Madison held the baby for the first time in the recovery room, tears streaming down her face as she counted the tiny fingers and toes. Helen was by her side, photographing the moment, but her expression was not just that of a proud grandmother. It was that of a general confirming that the most important piece on the board was safe and protected. Richard arrived at the hospital 3 hours after the birth, straight from a meeting with Japanese investors, according to his own words. He held his son with the hesitation of someone holding a valuable but fragile object. He doesn't quite know how to operate. He took photos that he immediately posted on social media with carefully crafted captions about fatherhood, family, and legacy. His followers responded with thousands of likes and comments, celebrating the heir to the Blackwood empire. But when he thought no one was looking, Helen saw the moment Richard handed Gabriel back to the nurse with poorly disguised relief, like someone fulfilling an unpleasant but necessary social obligation. Madison was discharged 5 days later, still weak but determined to build the perfect home for Gabriel. Richard provided a full staff of nannies, nurses, and nutritionists, all highly qualified and expensive enough to impress the couple's friends. But he himself remained absent, now with the added excuse that he was working double time to secure his son's financial future. Madison accepted the explanations because she wanted to believe them, because the alternative was to admit that her marriage was a fraud, built on empty promises and staged photos for Instagram. Helen, however, accepted nothing. She had temporarily moved into one of the guest rooms in the penthouse, officially to help Madison with Gabriel, but in reality, to closely observe Richard's every move. During the early morning hours when she rocked her grandson while Madison slept exhaustedly, Helen made discreet calls to her contacts, sent encrypted emails, and arranged meetings in quiet cafes in Lower Manhattan with people who preferred to operate away from the Wall Street spotlight. The first blow was subtle. One of the shell companies Vivian had created to hide Richard's assets during the planned divorce began to show tax irregularities. They weren't errors large enough to attract immediate IRS attention, but small inconsistencies that the internal auditors at Richard's holding company identified during a routine review. Richard blamed his accountant, fired him publicly with legal threats, and hired an international auditing firm to clean up the mess. He never suspected that the lead auditor was a former student of Helen's from her days lecturing on medical ethics at Columbia University, and that every supposedly corrected document contained new strategically planted errors, like financial landmines set to detonate at the right moment. Helen's second move was more personal. She began frequenting the same social circles as Vivian, not directly, but through friends who belonged to the same exclusive clubs, frequented the same restaurants, and attended the same charity events. Helen never confronted Vivian directly. Instead, she planted information through seemingly innocent conversations, comments on how sad it was to see families destroyed by ambition, fictional stories about lawyers who lost everything by getting involved with married clients. The seeds of paranoia were watered with whispered gossip in the right circles, insinuations about ethics investigations at the Bar Association, rumors about Vivian's clients being dissatisfied with her services. Richard began to notice that his business partners were slightly more cautious in meetings, that investors asked more detailed questions about corporate governance, that financial journalists suddenly took an interest in specific aspects of his operations they had previously ignored. Nothing was severe enough to cause panic, but the sum of the small irritations began to erode his usual self-confidence. He increased his work hours, became more aggressive in negotiations, and consequently spent even less time at home. Madison interpreted this as dedication to supporting the family. Helen knew it was the beginning of the unraveling. Over the next 3 months, while Gabriel grew healthy under the loving care of Madison and Helen, Richard's empire began to show fissures invisible to less trained eyes. A crucial merger with a Chicago construction firm failed at the last moment when one of the partners pulled out, citing concerns about the governance structure of Richard's company. A billion-dollar contract with the state government was lost to a smaller competitor after confidential documents from Richard's proposal were mysteriously leaked to the trade press. An American investor who was about to inject capital into the company's international expansion abruptly withdrew after a due diligence report revealed inconsistencies in the last 3 years' balance sheets. Richard blamed internal betrayals, hackers, unethical competitors. He didn't see the pattern because he was looking in the wrong direction. His suspicions fell on ambitious executives within his own company, on corporate rivals, even on politicians he had crossed in past negotiations. He would never suspect that the architect of his slow collapse was the grey-haired mother-in-law he occasionally saw at the penthouse, always quiet, always busy with her grandson, seemingly harmless in her cashmere cardigans and cups of tea. It was during one of these rare visits to the penthouse when Richard stopped by quickly to change between meetings that Helen executed her most audacious move. She waited for the moment Richard entered the Home Office to grab documents, then discreetly plugged a small device her contacts had provided into the office's Wi-Fi router. The device, no larger than a quarter, began mirroring all of Richard's office digital traffic to a secure server that Helen controlled. Emails, documents, video conferences, messages. Everything that passed through that network now had an invisible copy. In the data collected over the following weeks, Helen found exactly what she was looking for: detailed evidence of the abandonment plan, including explicit messages between Richard and Vivian, discussing strategies to minimize financial responsibilities for Gabriel, proposals to question paternity, even though they knew the child was biologically his, and even drafts of press releases that would paint Madison as mentally unstable and incapable of properly caring for her son. It was enough material to destroy Richard's reputation in any court in the country. But Helen wasn't ready to show her hand yet. Madison, protected in a bubble of innocence that Helen meticulously maintained, dedicated herself entirely to Gabriel. She interpreted Richard's absences as necessary sacrifices, convincing herself that once things stabilized at the company, he would be the present father he had promised to be. Helen didn't have the heart to destroy these illusions prematurely. Her daughter needed to be strong, physically and emotionally, before facing the truth about the man she had married. It was during one of Gabriel's routine pediatric appointments, 3 months after his birth, that Helen met Dr. Julian Kavanaugh, a renowned pediatrician who also saw patients at the private practice where they took the baby. During a casual conversation in the waiting room, while Madison was in the exam room, Helen discovered that Dr. Kavanaugh was not only a doctor, but also the president of an NGO that advocated for children's rights in cases of parental abandonment. He told heartbreaking stories of absent fathers, of businessmen who treated their children like numbers on a spreadsheet, of women who faced unequal legal battles against powerful ex-husbands. Helen listened intently and, at the end, invited Dr. Kavanaugh for coffee the next day. It was during that meeting, in a discreet coffee shop in Gramercy, that she revealed her situation, showing him the evidence she had collected about Richard's plans. Dr. Kavanagh was visibly disturbed, not just as a doctor concerned for Gabriel's well-being, but as someone who had witnessed the devastating consequences of similar abandonments. He offered the NGO's resources, contacts with specialized lawyers, and something more valuable: his experience navigating the American legal system for child protection in ways that powerful men like Richard often underestimated. Together, Helen and Dr. Kavanagh began to build a case that would not only be based on evidence of betrayal or planned abandonment, but on demonstrating a pattern of inadequate paternal behavior that would justify legal restrictions on custody and financial decisions involving Gabriel. Every absence of Richard's, every broken promise, every moment he prioritized meetings over his son, was meticulously documented through records that seemed innocent, but together painted a devastating portrait of parental neglect, elegantly disguised as corporate success. Meanwhile, the relationship between Richard and Vivian began to show its own cracks. The pressure from business problems made Richard more irritable and controlling. Vivian, accustomed to being treated as an equal partner, began to resent her role as the secret mistress, consoling an increasingly paranoid and less charming man. Their arguments became more frequent, the romantic meetings in private clinics replaced by tense conversations about legal and business strategies that never seemed to work as planned. Helen observed this deterioration with the clinical satisfaction of a surgeon watching a tumor respond to treatment. She didn't accelerate the process, only ensured that each small problem piled on top of the last, that every solution Richard attempted created two new problems, that the feeling of losing control became his new reality. And through it all, she maintained her posture as a devoted grandmother, making innocent comments about how much Gabriel looked like Richard, how wonderful it would be when his father had more time to be present, how the Blackwood family had such an impressive legacy to pass on to the little heir. Richard, in the rare moments he stopped to think about his personal life between business crises, felt something strange happening, but couldn't pinpoint exactly what. It was as if the universe had decided to conspire against him, turning every strategic decision into a disaster, every calculated move into a costly mistake. He would never suspect that the universe had a name, an address on the Upper East Side, and the infinite patience of someone who had spent decades suturing human hearts with millimeter precision. The first phase of Helen's plan was complete. Richard was destabilized but still functionally powerful. Madison was safe but still deluded. Gabriel was protected and growing healthy. Now it was time to tighten the noose, to turn minor irritations into genuine crises, to make Richard understand that his plan of abandonment would not be executed on his terms, but on the terms of a woman he had fatally underestimated for being just a seemingly fragile grandmother who spent her days caring for a baby and drinking tea while his empire crumbled brick by brick around him. 5 years passed, like a slow-motion film for some and at an accelerated speed for others. Gabriel turned 5 at an elaborate party at the most expensive venue in New York City, surrounded by classmates from his private school and the children of businessmen Richard insisted on inviting to maintain social appearances. The boy had grown healthy, intelligent, with his mother's green eyes and a facial structure unmistakably inherited from his father. Madison had transformed into a devoted mother who found purpose in motherhood, putting her architecture career on the back burner, a decision she said was temporary, but which Helen suspected was permanent. Richard, on the other hand, seemed to have aged 15 years in 5. The lines around his eyes were not just from age, but from the constant tension of managing an empire that inexplicably refused to grow at the speed his plans demanded. He remained wealthy, still moved in the same elite circles, but his position had stagnated while smaller competitors surpassed him. Every attempt to expand met with bureaucratic obstacles. Every new investment revealed unexpected complications. Every planned merger fell apart, for reasons his consultants could never satisfactorily explain. The marriage to Madison existed only on paper and in carefully staged photos for social media. Richard maintained a separate apartment near his office, visiting the Park Avenue penthouse only for necessary events and to uphold the illusion of a united family. Madison accepted this new normal with a resignation that broke Helen's heart. Her daughter had become an expert at rationalizing emotional abandonment, at finding excuses for absences, at believing that true love meant accepting crumbs of attention from a man who had long since stopped pretending to be interested. Vivian Castell, curiously, had also disappeared from Richard's life about 2 years prior. The breakup occurred after she was unexpectedly investigated by the Bar Association for alleged ethical misconduct in previous cases unrelated to Richard. The investigations didn't result in severe punishment, but they tarnished her reputation enough for major corporate clients to start seeking representation elsewhere. Vivian blamed Richard for not defending her publicly. He blamed her for exposing the company to legal risks, and the relationship imploded in a series of arguments that ended with her accepting a position at a smaller firm in Chicago. Richard never knew that every document that incriminated Vivian had been carefully selected and anonymously sent to the Bar Association by a source the investigators could never trace. Helen had become a constant presence in Gabriel's life, officially as a devoted grandmother, but in practice as the stable parental figure Richard never was. She took her grandson to the zoo, taught him chess, and told him stories about the Foster family and their roots in New England. Gabriel adored his grandmother with the unconditional intensity of childhood and often asked why his father never had time to play. Helen would reply with half-truths, saying that Daddy worked very hard to give them a comfortable life, but her eyes conveyed a more complex truth that the boy was still too young to understand. It was during Gabriel's 5th birthday party that Helen finally met the missing piece of her plan in person. Jonathan Foster, a distant cousin of Madison's, who worked as a prosecutor specializing in financial crimes in the city. The meeting was orchestrated by Helen through family connections, but seemed casual to everyone at the party. During a seemingly trivial conversation about sports and politics on the penthouse balcony, Helen casually mentioned her interest in better understanding how corporate fraud investigations worked, especially those involving misappropriation of funds and money, laundering through shell companies. Jonathan, a serious 40-year-old man with graying temples and a reputation for unshakable integrity, was intrigued by his distant cousin's apparently academic interest. Over the following weeks, they met several times for lunch, where Helen asked increasingly specific questions, always framed as the intellectual curiosity of a retired doctor considering writing a book on business ethics. It was only at their 3rd meeting that Helen placed an envelope on the table of the discreet restaurant in Lower Manhattan, containing copies of all the documents she had collected on Richard over the past 5 years. Jonathan leafed through the documents in growing silence, his face hardening with each page. He saw not just evidence of infidelity or family abandonment, but a clear pattern of questionable financial operations, shell companies created to hide assets, and transactions that suggested tax evasion on a scale that would justify an official investigation. As a prosecutor, he couldn't formally accept that evidence without compromising the chain of custody, but Helen wasn't offering him evidence for a trial. She was showing him a map that indicated where the district attorney's office should start digging with its own legal tools. Jonathan asked a single question. Why had Helen waited 5 years to bring this to light? Her answer was surgical in its simplicity. She needed Madison to be strong enough to handle the truth. She needed Gabriel to be old enough to have real memories of his father's neglect. She needed Richard to be sufficiently worn down by accumulated small failures for the final blow to break him completely. And most importantly, she needed to build a case so solid that no expensive lawyer could dismantle it. A pattern of behavior so well documented that Richard could not claim innocence or mistake. Jonathan promised to begin discreet inquiries, using Helen's documents only as a guide to uncover officially admissible evidence. The prosecutor's office had resources Helen lacked: subpoena power, access to bank records, the ability to freeze assets. But he warned that the process would be slow, that men like Richard had lawyers who knew how to stall investigations for years. Helen smiled and said that time was not an issue. She had already waited 5 years. She could wait another 1 or 2 if necessary. But the universe had other plans. 2 weeks after that conversation, during a board meeting at Richard's company, One of the minority investors asked unexpectedly detailed questions about certain transactions made 3 years earlier. Richard responded with his usual arrogance, but something in the investor's tone was different. There was specific knowledge there, not just generic suspicion. After the meeting, Richard ordered a full internal audit, certain there was a leak of confidential information. The audit revealed what Helen already knew: Vivian's shell companies, which Richard had kept active even after their breakup, had irregularities that, when exposed to the right light, clearly appeared designed to hide funds and manipulate balance sheets. Richard blamed Vivian, naturally, but the damage was done. 2 major investors requested emergency meetings. A board member tendered his resignation. The financial press began asking uncomfortable questions. It was at this moment of vulnerability that Helen decided it was time for Madison to know the truth. Not the whole truth about the 5 years of manipulation, but the truth about Richard that she deserved to know. On a rainy June afternoon, while Gabriel was at his swimming lesson, Helen sat down with her daughter in the penthouse living room and placed a tablet on the coffee table, displaying the messages recovered 5 years ago, conversations between Richard and Vivian planning the abandonment, legal documents outlining strategies to minimize financial responsibilities for Gabriel. Madison read in silence, her hands trembling slightly, tears streaming down her face without a sound. Helen held her as her daughter processed the destruction of 5 years of carefully maintained illusions. When she could finally speak, Madison asked the same question as Jonathan. Why had Helen waited so long to show her this? The answer was different this time, more emotional. Helen said she needed her daughter to be strong, for Gabriel to have a solid foundation, for the right moment to arrive when Madison could face the truth without destroying herself in the process. Madison wept for the marriage that had never truly existed, for the father Gabriel would never have, for the idealized version of Richard she had built in her mind. But when the tears finally dried, something new appeared in her eyes. It wasn't hatred exactly, but a cold determination that Helen recognized in herself. Madison asked what else her mother had discovered, what other truths were being kept from her. Helen, seeing that her daughter was ready, shared everything. Jonathan's investigation, the financial manipulations, the carefully executed 5-year plan to dismantle Richard's empire brick by brick. Madison's reaction surprised even Helen. Instead of being shocked or accusing her mother of manipulation, she asked how she could help. She wanted to ensure that Gabriel would never again be treated as a disposable obstacle, that Richard would face real consequences, that the truth about who he was would become public. Mother and daughter, united by the same protective determination, began to plan the final moves together. Richard, oblivious to the fact that 2 of the people he had most underestimated in his life were now operating in concert against him, continued trying to put out corporate fires that seemed to sprout spontaneously. He cancelled a scheduled trip to Miami to deal with internal investigations. He spent sleepless nights reviewing old contracts, trying to identify the error that was exposing his operations. He even considered hiring private investigators to find out who was leaking information, never realizing the leak came from within his own arrogance, from the digital trails he had left over the years, believing himself to be untouchable. The final straw came from where Richard least expected it. Gabriel, now 5½, began asking questions about his father in sessions with the child psychologist Madison had hired to help the boy process his father's absence. The professional's observations, carefully documented, described a pattern of emotional neglect that, combined with the financial evidence Jonathan was collecting and the documents Helen had preserved, formed a devastating case not only of corporate fraud, but of systematic parental negligence. Helen, Madison, and Jonathan met for the first time, all 3 together, on a cold July night in Helen's Upper East Side apartment. They spread documents across the dining table, building the final narrative. It wouldn't just be a criminal case about financial fraud. It wouldn't just be a divorce with accusations of infidelity. It would be a complete and public deconstruction of the image Richard had cultivated. A revelation that behind the successful businessman was a man who had planned to abandon his own son before he was even born, who had treated his family as a corporate obstacle, who had built part of his fortune on questionable legal structures while posing as a pillar of the New York business community. The final plan was designed to be executed in 3 simultaneous waves. Jonathan would formalize the prosecutor's investigation using his own official channels to build the criminal case. Madison would file for divorce and sole custody of Gabriel, using the evidence of the abandonment plans and the psychological evaluations as her basis. And Helen would ensure that the press received carefully edited versions of the story, not through obvious leaks, but through investigative journalists she knew from her time saving the lives of important people, reporters who owed her decades-old favors and had reputations for integrity sufficient to make their reporting be taken seriously. Richard Blackwood believed he was fighting abstract business problems, market bad luck, corporate conspiracies. He didn't realize he was about to face something far more devastating: the meticulously planned justice of 3 people he had underestimated, ignored, and dismissed as irrelevant. The siege was complete. All that was left was to tighten the final knot. The morning of August 15th broke with a clear sky over New York City, a rarity for that time of year. Richard woke up in his separate apartment feeling a strange tranquility, as if his business problems were finally beginning to resolve themselves. He had closed an important deal with Chinese investors the night before, an operation that would bring in enough fresh capital to stabilize operations and silence the questioning board members. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to believe he had regained control. That illusion lasted exactly 43 minutes. At 8:12 a.m., while sipping imported espresso and reviewing emails, 3 seismic events occurred simultaneously. His lawyer called to inform him that Madison had filed for divorce, accompanied by a petition for sole custody of Gabriel based on evidence of planned parental abandonment. His accountant called seconds later, saying the IRS had just notified the company of a formal investigation into tax evasion, and his cell phone began to vibrate uncontrollably with notifications of an article published on the website of one of the country's most respected financial newspapers, detailing irregularities in Blackwood's operations with a surgical precision that could only have come from extremely well-informed internal sources. Richard dropped his cup, the dark coffee spreading across the Italian marble like a liquid premonition. He frantically called his head of corporate security, his legal team, and the public relations consultants he kept on retainer for precisely such crises. The responses came quickly, but were devastating. The IRS investigation was based on solid official documents, suggesting an internal leak or cooperation from someone with privileged access. Madison's divorce filing was accompanied by Gabriel's psychological evaluations and recovered messages showing the planned abandonment in details Richard believed he had erased years ago. And the newspaper article cited anonymous but verifiable sources who clearly had deep knowledge of the company's operations. Richard's first reaction was furious denial. He believed he was the victim of a conspiracy, of corporate enemies who had finally found a way to destroy him. He dressed quickly and drove to the Park Avenue penthouse, determined to confront Madison and find out how she had obtained those documents. What he found when he walked into the apartment using his key changed everything. Madison was in the living room, not alone and crying as he expected, but sitting calmly beside Helen and a man Richard didn't immediately recognize. Her composure, the way she looked at him not with anger but with a cool, appraising gaze he had never seen before, was more disturbing than any emotional outburst. Helen served tea as if they were receiving a social call, and it was only when the man introduced himself that Richard felt the floor completely disappear. Jonathan Foster, Madison's cousin, and a prosecutor. Richard understood then that he wasn't facing just a messy divorce or isolated business problems. He was at the center of a coordinated, legal yet devastating operation conducted by people he had dismissed as irrelevant. Helen explained calmly, her voice maintaining the professorial tone of someone stating medical facts, that for the past 5 years she had meticulously documented Richard's every move, every piece of evidence of his intentions, every digital trail he had left believing he was protected by money and influence. Richard tried to bluff, threatening lawsuits for invasion of privacy, defamation, conspiracy. Jonathan responded with, the patience of someone who had faced powerful men before, explaining that every document in their possession had been obtained legally or had led to official investigations using the proper tools of justice. Richard's messages with Vivian about abandoning his family, recovered from backup servers he had forgotten to wipe, the shell companies, discovered through cross-audits that any competent investigation would reveal, the plan to question Gabriel's paternity, documented in emails that Richard himself had carelessly archived. It was Madison, finally, who delivered the blow that shattered Richard's arrogance. She spoke in a firm voice, without tears, about how she had spent 5 years believing lies, rationalizing abandonment, teaching Gabriel to love a father who never wanted to be one. She described the nights her son asked why Daddy never played with him, the birthdays where Richard showed up only for photos, the times he was sick and called for the father who was in meetings deemed more important. She didn't scream, she didn't insult him. She simply exposed the naked truth of who Richard had always been, a man so consumed by ambition that he had treated his family as a corporate obstacle to be managed and eventually discarded. Richard tried one last desperate move. He offered generous financial settlements, promised to be more present in Gabriel's life, suggested they could pretend none of it had happened if they would just withdraw the legal actions and avoid a public scandal. It was Helen who replied, and for the first time since Richard had met her, he saw beyond the facade of the gentle grandmother. She explained that the goal was never money or personal revenge. It was to ensure that Gabriel grew up protected from a father who saw him as a liability to be minimized, that Richard faced real consequences for his choices, and that no other woman or child would be destroyed by the public relations and legal manipulation machine he had built. In that moment, something inside Richard broke. It wasn't remorse exactly, but the devastating realization that he had lost. Not just his marriage or part of his fortune, or even his potential freedom if the criminal investigations progressed. He had lost the narrative of his own life, the carefully cultivated image of a successful businessman, a family man, a pillar of the community. It was all crumbling, not due to bad luck or an external conspiracy, but because he himself had built that castle on foundations of lies that 3 people had meticulously exposed to the light. The following months were a legal and media whirlwind. Richard tried to use his resources for damage control, but every defensive move revealed new layers of problems. The Chinese investors withdrew from the deal upon reading about the tax evasion investigations. Board members resigned en masse. Corporate clients began taking their contracts to competitors. The company didn't go bankrupt, but it was reduced to a fraction of its former size, forcing Richard to sell personal assets to maintain basic operations. The divorce proceedings revealed details to the public that Richard had tried to keep private. The messages planning Gabriel's abandonment were read in open court. Psychologists testified about the impact of paternal neglect on the child. Financial experts explained how Richard had created structures to hide assets that should have belonged to the family. The judge, a 60-year-old woman with a reputation for being stern but fair, granted Madison sole custody of Gabriel, ordered Richard to pay substantial child support based on his real income, not his officially declared one, and most importantly, ordered judicial supervision of any contact between father and son until Richard completed a family therapy program and demonstrated an ability to put the child's needs above his own convenience. The IRS investigation resulted in heavy fines, but no criminal charges. Jonathan had carefully calibrated the revelations, exposing enough irregularities to destroy Richard's reputation without crossing the line into crimes that would result in prison. As he explained to Helen and Madison, the goal was justice, not revenge. Richard needed to live with the consequences of his choices, to face daily the reality of his diminished empire and tarnished reputation. But he would not be turned into a martyr through excessive criminal prosecution. Gabriel, shielded as much as possible from the media storm, continued to grow up under the care of Madison and Helen. The child psychologist reported that the boy was processing the situation remarkably well, likely because his father's absence was not new, merely official. He had questions, of course, about why Daddy didn't live with them anymore, why they couldn't visit him freely. Madison answered with age-appropriate truths, explaining that adults sometimes make difficult choices, that true love means wanting what's best for people even when it complicates our own lives, and that some people need to learn important lessons before they can be the parents their children deserve. A year after that fateful August, life had found a new equilibrium. Madison had resumed her architecture career, working part-time on residential projects that allowed her to be present for Gabriel. Helen divided her time between caring for her grandson and taking on some medical consulting for complex cases, discovering that full retirement was never her calling. Gabriel thrived in school, surrounded by the unconditional love of his mother and grandmother, learning from their example what resilience, dignity, and justice meant. Richard, on the other hand, lived in a smaller apartment in the West Village, managing what was left of his company. He had completed the court-ordered family therapy program, a painful process that forced him to confront truths about himself he had spent decades avoiding. His requests to visit Gabriel were still supervised, monthly meetings in a neutral setting with a psychologist present. The boy was polite but distant, treating his father like a known but not intimate adult, and Richard felt every moment of that distance as a deserved but no less painful punishment. It was during one of these supervised visits in a sunny playground in Central Park that Richard finally understood the extent of what he had lost. Gabriel was playing on the slide, laughing with genuine joy, and for a moment he called out to his grandmother Helen, who was watching from a nearby bench. The ease with which the boy ran to her, the way she scooped him up and tickled him as he giggled, the obvious connection between them, it all showed Richard the relationship he could have had if he hadn't treated his family like a corporate problem to be solved. When Gabriel went back to play, Helen sat down next to Richard on the bench. They were silent for long minutes before she spoke. It wasn't to rub it in his face or celebrate a victory. Helen simply asked if he finally understood why she had done it all. Richard, his voice choked with emotion, admitted that he did. She hadn't been destroying him out of cruelty, but protecting Gabriel from the destruction Richard would have caused if his original plan had been executed. Every move Helen had made for 5 years was to ensure that when the truth finally came out, the boy would be surrounded by enough love and stability not to be crushed by it. Helen then offered something unexpected: hope. She said that if Richard truly changed, if he learned to put Gabriel's needs above his own convenience, if he demonstrated through consistent actions over years, not months, that he was committed to being a real father, then maybe one day Gabriel would choose to have a real relationship with him. It wouldn't be the automatic relationship of right that Richard believed he was entitled to, but something earned through genuine effort and real change. It would be harder, more humbling, but infinitely more valuable than anything he had built before. 2 years after that meeting, on a golden summer evening, Gabriel was at his 8th birthday party, a simple affair at Madison and Helen's apartment. They now lived together in a cozy place near Gramercy Park. Richard was present not as the center of attention, but as a guest who had earned the privilege through 2 years of consistent therapy, regular visits even when Gabriel preferred to play with friends, and concrete demonstrations that he finally understood what it meant to be a father. When it was time for Gabriel to blow out the candles on his cake, he looked around the room filled with school friends, teachers who adored him, Madison and Helen, who had sacrificed so much to protect him, and Richard, who was slowly learning to earn his place in his son's life. The boy closed his eyes and made his secret wish, but Helen, watching the scene with tears of happiness in her eyes, suspected she knew what it was. Gabriel had wished for a real family, not the performative kind from Instagram photos, but one built on truth, sacrifice, and unconditional love. The story of the Foster Blackwood family became a case study discussed in family law and business justice circles in New York, not for the sordid details or the fall of a tycoon, but for the way 3 people used the legal system with surgical precision to protect a child and ensure that powerful men faced real consequences for attempting to abandon their paternal responsibilities. Helen eventually gave lectures on medical and family ethics, always using anonymous cases clearly inspired by her own experience. Madison wrote a book about rebuilding a life after betrayal and finding strength in single motherhood, and Gabriel grew up surrounded by examples of resilience, integrity, and the power of people who refuse to silently accept injustice. Richard never regained the empire he once owned. His company stabilized as a mid-sized operation, profitable but no longer dominant. He learned to live with less material luxury, but with something money had never bought him: the possibility of a genuine relationship with his son, earned inch by inch through real change and consistent effort. On the nights he visited Gabriel and was allowed to put him to bed, rare but precious moments, Richard understood that Helen had given him not just justice but also a second chance he didn't deserve, but that Gabriel deserved the option to one day offer. Years later, when Gabriel turned 15 and was an articulate teenager who fully understood his family's history, he wrote an essay for school about unlikely heroes. He didn't write about comic book superheroes or famous athletes. He wrote about a surgeon grandmother who used medical precision to execute family justice, about a mother who found the strength to rebuild her life when all seemed lost, and about a prosecutor who believed the legal system could protect children even from powerful parents. At the end of the essay, Gabriel mentioned his father too, not as a villain, but as a lesson in how people can change when they finally face the truth about who they are, and how second chances must be earned, never simply given.